Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of No, It's Not Just the Weather. I am Alfredo, and here with me is and Carlota.
Hi.
And so this week's episode, we'll call it Political Narratives, Climate Change in the Political Right and the Political Left, and the link with polarization. So, the topic of today's podcast, political polarization. It is a very contested topic, as we know. We can hear it a lot in the media, in a lot of places, and it has various definitions. But it is a topic that is increasingly being discussed in public, and there are trends that appear to show that it is an issue that worries the public, which sees it as potentially dangerous for living together. So that's why we try to approach this from the perspective of focusing on its interaction with climate change.
Yes, and to have a fruitful discussion, we're going to be talking about in this podcast in different sections. First, we will define political polarization within the climate change debate. Because polarization is an extremely broad topic, so we want to narrow it down a little bit. Then we will give you some disclaimers before we start the actual discussion. And from there, we move on to the right-wing discourses and their idea of an environmental threat, to then move on to the political left and how the idea of climate change fuels left-wing populism. And then, after we've covered all of this, we will try and talk to you about effective action strategies. So, once we have this out of the way, let's start with the introduction. What exactly is political polarization? We chose a definition from a paper by Kempf and Susura in 2024, and it reads as following. It can be referred to as both the partisan differences between individuals and the political uniformity within groups, which then contributes to a landscape of politically segregated environments. And then, while looking at some more of the research, we can find the following findings. For example, there is a general trend of increasing polarization, and this is reflected in dislike or distrust for supporters of the other party. It also influences decisions on both political and apolitical domains. So it also creates a division within contrasting groups or belief systems.
And I think we can really see what Carlota is telling us about in real-life examples. Some of the many elections that we saw this year, it's been perhaps the year with the most elections. I don't know.
I think it was the year with the most elections.
And in a lot of them, we saw a lot of arguments that were based entirely on us versus them. We are such and we are against such and such people.
Mm-hmm. And then research conducted by Smith, Bogdan, and Mayer this year shows that there is an increase in polarization towards environmental issues. But the thing is that both sides appear to be shifting away. It's not only one side that is having more radical arguments, and that makes the gap widen even more. It is, in fact, a dynamic in which both sides are diverging. Well, this podcast episode will explore some of this dynamic. However, we will discuss it further in the next section.
And this next section is about nuances to the argument and trying to find where does that difference actually lie when talking about polarization in climate change. And before we move on, as we said, there's going to be a very small disclaimer. We will often mention right-wing and left-wing, which are concepts that can be referred in other ways in a more day-to-day conversation, such as conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, or many more depending on the national context. It is important for us to mention that even though these concepts are used interchangeably in our daily life, they don't actually always mean the same thing, and that's why we stick to using the more general right-wing and left-wing terms. So we avoid national connotations that may not apply in all contexts, and we recognize that to a large extent, this is a very broad oversimplification of reality, as it divides nuanced arguments into a simple in favor versus against, and all the different perspectives humans can have, all the political spectrum, it is divided into two broad, encompassing and oftentimes internally contradicting groups. So we tried to keep it simple to be able to study the phenomenon and propose some general ideas, dynamics, and possibly reach some useful conclusions, which is ultimately the goal of this episode.
Right. The paper we are basing on was written by Lalou and others. It was conducted in the UK in 2022. It concludes that right-wing and left-wing people do care about different environmental issues. But despite prioritizing different issues among the political spectrum, people generally agree on which type of actions are most effective. Well, obviously with certain exceptions, such as taxing environmentally harmful activities, which is generally perceived by the right wing negatively. Therefore, policymakers, campaigns, and the media should focus not on which issue should be prioritized, but point out actions towards which there is this consensus.
Yeah, and some examples for these actions that you mentioned could be maybe removing terms related to climate change, such as fossil fuels, carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions, from persuasive messaging, in order to increase support from right-wing respondents. For example, using the term air pollution instead of climate change has shown increased right-wing support.
I think that what you are talking about, Carlota, is very interesting because it sort of shows an idea of not trying to convince people of changing their whole belief system, but rather focusing on the action itself.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think this is a great place to start off with our next section, which talks about right-wing and the idea of an environmental threat. And we have been looking at some research, for example, a paper published by Hofarth and Hudson in 2016. Research generally suggests that environmental attitudes are to some degree ideologically driven. You know, right-leaning public is more likely to deny climate change when solutions are portrayed as limiting the free market and believe that it is less risky and dangerous.
Some researchers also argue that one of the main drivers for polarization related to climate change is the political right wing characterizing and perceiving environmentalists as a literal threat. The UK Chancellor George Osborne referred to green campaigners as environmental Taliban. Young climate activists in Australia were called Hitler Youth, and Fred Singer, a right-wing climate denialist, said Obama was undertaking an anti-energy regulatory hijab.
Personally, I think it's crazy that they can get away with saying stuff like this in the media.
Yeah, that's directly appealing to emotion and
Definitely.
us versus them.
It is, yeah, and environmentalists that way are characterized as an outgroup that can really be a threat. This makes messages with an environmental concern not only to be rejected, but also reached against. It potentially happens due to the perception that status quo and social order are threatened. Therefore, when this in-group perceives that the out-group is receiving more attention or having more influence in the policy-making processes, polarization deepens even more. So, with this logic, it can be predicted that more climate action will only fit this dynamic where the right wing, as a self-perceived in-group, sees environmentalists as a threatening out-group.
Well, that's a great explanation.
Yeah, it is. And I think this is a great cue to move on to our next section, where we're going to be switching to the other side of the spectrum and discussing the political left and how its idea of climate change fuels left-wing populism. The environmental movement has been established in general terms since the 1960s and 70s, and then it transitioned during the 1990s and the 2000s. At first, we had market-based solutions such as emissions trading and carbon pricing, as well as others such as global climate negotiations, becoming a strong focus. However, a left-wing critique of capitalism has become linked to the environmental agenda and faces some dilemmas in how it presents the issue and then suggests a solution. First, the climate left argues for broader action by governments, reorganizing the energy sector, curbing excessive consumption, and more. Capitalism and the market cannot be placed above all, as past policies have failed and corporate greed is one of the key drivers of climate change. Its argument is also supported by how climate change affects the most vulnerable, and it is a global issue. The left, thus, sees itself as the only political tendency in the West and has consistently stood for cosmopolitan solidarity.
So, if the problem is capitalism, the answer of the replacement is not exactly clear. Take, for example, the US politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the version of the Green New Deal she proposed. It would address multiple dimensions such as racism, inequality, and links the climate agenda to the demand for healthcare for all. It appeals to what she calls frontline communities. This way, this agenda faces some questioning from key sectors. The idea of restructuring so many sectors, such as energy, makes a large section of the blue-collared workforce to now ask whether such drastic changes would benefit or actually be bad for them. Well, another example is that healthcare linked to climate change might make private industries oppose those actions, as it might hurt their industries and their incomes.
So to wrap up this section, we can go over a question that emerges from what both of you have been talking about, which is if climate change is linked in these arguments with such broad policies and such large-scale restructuring of industries and the general economy, is this actually putting a stop to more and better, specifically climate action, as it is actually creating more political opposition? Mm-hmm. This is why some authors have started pointing out how this appears to be a form of left-wing populism that takes climate change as the real need for immediate action as one of its main arguments. So if populism fuels polarization, then this broad approach to climate change that links climate action to broad social changes might also be contributing to polarization regarding this topic.
So, finally, for our last section, what can be done for more effective action? Research, education, and information are key. And understanding how psychological barriers, ideological barriers, and polarization are preventing climate actions are key to be more effective. In the paper we mentioned previously by Lalou, it's said that there might be more agreement on the actions, not the issues, than previously thought. Therefore, politicians, campaigns, and media should focus persuasive discourse on the modes of action rather than on the prioritization of particular issues.
And I think that sums up a lot of what we have been saying throughout the episode. And I think this is a good place to conclude a little bit. And for that, I would like to leave our audience with some questions to, think about and reflect. For example, should we deal with political polarization in general first in order to deal with polarization regarding climate change? Or deal first with climate change polarization and build from there towards decreasing the general polarization? In other words, is it better to deal first with the general to fix the details, or fix the details in order to build some sort of base from which the general state of polarization can be decreased? Perhaps, as we saw, there is some consensus regarding the need for action and the types of action. Therefore, at this point, it might be useful to take advantage of any agreement and start building from there.
So thank you so much for listening. We hope that you find this topic interesting as much as we did. You can find all of our sources, as always, in the bio and all the papers we cite from. Don't forget to follow us on other social media at No It's Not Just the Weather. We are both on Instagram and TikTok. And we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, bye. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.